everybody, today we are debating whether or not we should push for trans normalization, and we are starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for another epic debate. This is going to be an interesting one, folks. A topic we rarely delve into, and we have 4 guests with us. We are very excited to have these guys, really pleasant fellas. Getting to talk to them beforehand, I really enjoyed it, and want to let you know, if it's your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button as we have a lot more debates coming up. So, for example, Dr. Richard Carrier and Jonathan Sheffield will be debating whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. That'll be tomorrow, and that should be an exciting one. And many others. For example, we are currently working on a debate for next week, Feminism on Trial. So that should be a juicy one as 2 women debaters come on and collide on that topic. And want to let you know, these guys that you're listening to today, I put all of their links, all 4 of their links are in the description. So that way if you're listening and you're like, I like that, I want more, you can hear more. Click on those links where you can hear plenty more. And also want to let you know, for today, we're going to have a fairly flexible format. So it's going to be 12 minutes or so, split by each side, and that's kind of flexible, followed by open conversation. And there are some subtopics, you could say, that these gentlemen will be exploring throughout the debate. I'll let them explain those. And want to let you know, if you have a question, feel free to fire it into the old live chat. And if you tag me with @ModernDayDebate, it makes it easier for me to get every single question in that Q&A list. Super Chat is also an option, in which case you can make a comment toward the speakers as well, which they, of course, will get a chance to respond to, and it'll push your question or comment to the top of the list for the Q&A. So with that, do want to let you know, last point, this is a special point, is you look up here and you say, oh, usually all the people, like almost all of the people that email me are white males. So I want to let you know, we are so happy to have you. No matter what walk of life, if you want to come on and debate, because I know sometimes people are like, are any of these people trans who are debating tonight? As far as I know, not that I know of. However, if you're trans and you'd like to come on and debate, the door is completely open. As we've had trans friends come on in the past, people from all walks of life, we really do want to let you know we are absolutely happy to have you regardless of what walk of life you're from. And with that, very excited to have these guys. It's going to be a lot of fun. Oh yeah, so sorry folks. Forgive me that I know that my mic is like bouncing up sometimes a little bit more than usual. Working on that. Thanks for your feedback. Appreciate it. And we usually have the affirmative go first. So we will kick it over to Mouthy Infidel and Jangles as we're thrilled to have you guys here. Thanks so much. The floor is all yours.
You want to go first, Mouthy?
I think you can go first. Your opening statements are better.
Okay. Well, way to build it up to be disappointed. All right. All right, y'all. So I pre-wrote my statements, so apologize for reading off of a script here. So I'll begin with what is essentially a sincerely held platitude that I have and work from there. Trans men are men, trans women are women, non-binary people are valid, and reducing stigmatization has and will markedly increase their well-being in society at no expense and even to the benefit of everyone else. To the best of my ability, every claim I make during this opening statement and during the body of the debate is backed up by empirical data. And if you'll forgive my terrible organizational skills, I'll be happy to provide it at any time. Our identities are our way of making sense of a socially derived categorization as they relate to our own personal biology and experiences. A Christian is not a Christian because of some innate physical feature they possess, but because of a complex biological need for answers and guidance interacting with the world they live in. Likewise, identifying as a man is more than just a recognition of what dangles or doesn't on your body, but is born from a culturally and historically derived understanding of the differing roles and expectations assigned to you as a member of a dichotomized view of gender, and how that helps you make sense of the internal drives you experience. At the root of this is a neural structure that assisted our most primitive selves in identifying potential mates for the purposes of reproduction. It was only later codified and given meaning through society and culture. Put simply, gender identity is not a new postmodern invention, but rather an intrinsic guiding force for the current or eventual sexual drive that will manifest itself differently depending on one's stage of life and current environment. However, due to the incredibly varied tapestry of human development, some people have a gender identity that more closely matches the one typical of those born with different genitalia, with a whole host of possibilities beyond two concrete options. This has explained homosexuality in the past, and it explains transgender identities now. Acknowledging that trans women are women and trans men are men simply recognizes how they've seen fit to explain their own experiences living in our culture. And it is not a lie or feeding into delusion to concede this fact. As these identities are valid and useful to those who adopt them, with no threat or harm imposed on others in doing so, it therefore makes sense to destigmatize these identities and promote the freedom of choice and expression our society should strive towards. The overwhelming preponderance of evidence confirming the effectiveness of transitioning in alleviating gender dysphoria is, in my opinion, irrefutable, as is the, in hindsight, obvious evidence that confirming and respecting that identity does the same. And though evidence proving a negative is a fool's errand, I've yet to encounter solid evidence showing that supporting and affirming trans identities harms society in any way that goes beyond curtailing to bigotry. We rightfully do not put the needs of white supremacists on par with those people with people of color when considering the supposed harm caused by integration. And unless there is data to the contrary, the same applies to trans people existing as their gender in society. To sum up my opening statement, trans people are who they say they are. The empirical evidence heavily suggests that transitioning related services are effective at improving their quality of life, and increasing their acceptance in society will do no harm to anyone while immensely benefiting said trans people and those who care about them. That's it.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, I think Jangles basically hit every point that I think is like important to go over in an opening statement on this issue. But I guess I can just sort of give my own framing. So what I care about is data unequivocally.
Hold on one second.
Oh,
Just to be sure that we don't miss a word, I think that we had just a slight connection issue there. So I think the last like 10 seconds, if you'd be willing to repeat that. Thanks for your patience.
oh yeah, sorry. So what I care about fundamentally is doing away with as much human suffering as possible in society. Given that the data is unequivocally clear that the primary source of suffering in the trans community is the stigma which society has levied at them, which not only harms trans people but has spillover effects into the general population due to the interaction of different demographics in any given society, and given that the data is unequivocally clear that when trans people are more accepted and able to express their gender in accordance with how they identify, it seems that with the aim of mitigating human suffering in mind, the only logical response is to push unequivocally for the acceptance and destigmatization of trans people in society.
You got it. With that, we will kick it over to CJ and Richard. Thanks as well for being here. The floor is all yours.
Do you want to go first, CJ?
Either way, I'm not worried.
Well, I got this is the only thing I'm going to have that's prepared. So if you don't care, I'll take it.
Yeah, go ahead.
The first one. All right. As a society, the past 2 decades, we have taken drastic steps in improving the lives of trans individuals, especially through medical advancement, improvement in psychiatric care, and better diagnosis of gender dysphoria across the board. Along with these incredible steps to improve the lives of people that are struggling with an internal conflict, we must also make inroads at eliminating discrimination towards these trans individuals. We have, through legislation and judicial interpretation, along with just general tolerance built up in our country and many other countries around the world, created an environment where people attempting to live their lives as the opposite gender have that ability. And while many transgender individuals still face discrimination and harassment currently, the percentage of them that face harassment has gone down, while the self-harm and suicide rates have not budged from their astronomical levels. We must work to better understand what is going on in the minds of this community, because there is reason to have serious concern for any group of people that experiences depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, attempted suicide, and successful committing of suicide at orders of magnitude that are greater than anything in the general population. Studies have shown sorry about that. Studies have shown that transgender individuals, including those that have completed genital reassignment surgery, are 12 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts than a member of the general population, 18 times more likely to attempt suicide. The 2015 U.S. Transgender survey found that 81.7% of the respondents said that they had seriously considered suicide during their lifetime. 81.7%. Now, you can attribute all of those absurd numbers strictly to the stigmatization and discrimination of these trans individuals. But I want to believe that both of these two and the whole audience is a little bit more big brain than that. There is clearly a bigger issue going on, and I believe that it has everything to do with our understanding of how we treat these individuals experiencing gender dysphoria. Our current systems are untested, unfounded, and potentially harmful. We must work not to destigmatize, as we have learned that simply making it not weird or socially acceptable to bring no solution. To get a solution, we must remove the politics from this discussion and insert medical professionals that are doing correct studies that are going to lead to actual advancements in care and treatment. And I'm done.
All right. So I think fundamentally this question boils down to the question of whether or not trans women are women and vice versa. Quite frankly, the question of whether or not we should normalize something, I think fundamentally should hinge on whether or not said something is true. For example, should we normalize the idea that everybody's third child is a purple unicorn? Probably not, because it isn't correct, right? On the flip side, when people ask the question, should we normalize things like the equality of the sexes and genders, sexes and races and things of that nature, that is something that is intrinsically obvious to a lot of people. And so it actually made sense to make that kind of an argument and normalize that sort of a thing, right? So when we look at the question here, are trans women women, are trans men men? I think the answer is obviously, objectively, indisputably, it's not even close, no. And I must say, I fear tremendously for a society that cannot recognize such a plain and obvious fact, because this is one of the most, and I know I'm using kind of loaded language here, but I'm doing it on purpose, I assure you. This is one of the most plain and practical facts in human existence. It has been recognized by every single scientific field, every single field of study, whether it's philosophy or literature or poetry or history or so on. Every nation and culture, without any exception, right? Every religion, it is literally indisputable. It is something that is known by 3 and 4-year-olds, right? And the reason I point that sort of a thing out is because if we cannot even accurately deduce this most obvious of facts, to quote G.K. Chesterton, a fact as practical as potatoes, right? If we are not capable of doing that, then how can we possibly reason as a society on anything at all? Right? Forget a slippery slope. I am saying we are essentially saying 2 + 2 can equal something other than 4 right now is what we are saying, right? And that needs to be made plainly clear, because when we look at these issues, the issues that were brought up by my colleague here, right, such as the incredibly high suicide rate, the incredibly high rates of depression, of drug use, and so on and so forth, right? That is something that I think we can take a step back, and if we're being logical and reasonable about this, very obviously deduce is something that is worth note, right? And it's also worth note as this is happening, as these incredibly negative things are happening, it just so happens that also these people are mutilating themselves incredibly and having a outright, blatantly delusional idea. And I say that without offense, by the way. People often say, hey, why do you think transgender people are invalid, or so on and so forth? Let me say that if that is the argument you are making against me, I am very disappointed to know what you think of the mentally ill, because schizophrenic people are not invalid. Depressed people are not invalid, right? The being mentally ill does not make you invalid, right? However, if we went up to a schizophrenic person and we started saying, no, dude, those voices in your head telling you to, do whatever crazy thing they're telling you to do, the visions you're seeing that nobody else seems to be able to see, the auditory hallucinations that make you feel like there's somebody behind every corner that are getting you paranoid, they're totally legit, my friend. And don't let anybody tell you otherwise, because if so, they're a bigot, right? That's nonsense. That's nonsense. And not only is it nonsense, it is cruel. It is incredibly cruel, because this person will go on to do something we don't know what. Of course, you can list tons of things, but we do know from the past that either mistreating or not treating people with severe mental disorders like bipolar, schizophrenia, so on and so forth, leads them to end up doing incredibly terrible things. Because a lot of times when these delusions are fed, right, that it leads to something that breaks when reality eventually comes crashing in. And then these people have to actually sit there and contemplate the fact that their entire worldview has been destroyed and people around them have just been propping this sort of a thing up. I go on a little bit of a tangent there, but just to make the point that I think it is actually legitimately cruel to the person we are talking about to actually tell them these delusions are not only okay, but that they're correct. And that biological facts that are both obvious to the eye, like the largeness of males comparatively to females, and the presence of pronounced breasts on females and things like that, right? Or things that are not obvious to the eye, like, for example, monthly period cycles, or the larger amount of testosterone in males, and so on and so forth, right? If we are going to deny all of these things, right, just simply so we can pretend that we are more virtuous, so simply so we can pretend that we are more enlightened as a society, I think what in reality we're going to do is we're going to completely throw away reason, and we're going to throw away reason at the detriment of a severely mentally ill population. And that is where I would concede my time.
All right, with that, we will jump into the open discussion section. Couple of things really quick, folks. First, Kevin JIB, saw you subscribe. Thanks so much and welcome to the community. Also, want to let you know, we are working on getting our debates onto podcasts. So we will keep you updated on that, folks. We are very excited for it, as it's been a while. We've been trying to get this next move done. And so with that, we're going to jump into the open discussion section. This is a pleasure to have you guys here. I'm sure that you guys, this will be fun. So thanks so much. And the floor is all yours.
Well, I'm very glad to hear from everybody involved here that we're all fans of reason, we're all fans of evidence, we're all fans of science, which is fantastic. And like I said in my opening statement, I currently have 21 studies in front of me, 5 of which are meta-analyses, actually more than that, which are meta-analyses to support my claims here. So I'm very much in favor of reason and evidence, so I'm glad we're there. So I would just question a few of the claims that were made in the opening statement. So just because you went first, and sorry if I overstep my, if I talk too much, Mouthy, sorry. So Todd, you said that you essentially said that studies have shown that despite societal improvements in our treatment of trans people, the suicide rate hasn't budged and hasn't affected it at all. And that's, to the best of your knowledge, trans people attempt suicide at a rate that is 18 times higher than the general population. Do you still stand by that? And do you have any source to back that up?
I'm sorry, repeat, what was the number again? I do have the source for you.
Yes, 18 times higher than the 18 times attempts.
Yeah, that
than the
came from. Do you want me to link it to you in chat?
You can link it, or you can just say this title of the study, and I'll try to Google it.
That one came from. Did that come from? I know that that may have been from. Was that the Guardian article? Yeah, the Guardian article pushed me to. The study came from. Sorry, I got to find the link.
No problem. One thing,
if you want to continue, and I can go find it, and then we can double back on that if you have any other questions that I can answer.
Sure.
In the meantime.
I think Jangles, they're having a little trouble hearing you. If you're able to turn your mic.
Is this a little bit better? I turned up my mic.
Thanks so much.
Cool. So while you look for that study, I have a few studies here that show that transitioning is, like I said in my opening statement, it's pretty irrefutable that transitioning helps the mental health and well-being of trans people. Let's see. Let's pull up one at random from what I got here. So I have them. All right, let's go. Yeah.
I do have it for you. It was a 2015. It's a 2015 U.S. transgender survey.
Was that by UCLA?
Transgender people. I believe so. It's the largest survey of transgender people in the U.S. to date.
Oh, excellent. And I'm very familiar with that survey. And so you claimed that this showed that transition doesn't help at all. Is that what you claimed?
It's not that it doesn't help at all. It's that it does not alleviate the risk of suicide. Do you get what I'm saying? It's still 12 times higher than the general population, not 12 times higher than the trans women who don't go on hormones, if I have that right.
Okay, that survey does not say that. This survey did not take into account the timing of the suicide attempt and the lifetime of these people. So you cannot make any sort of claim, and the survey says this pretty clearly on page 3 or 4, that you cannot make any sort of claims as to the effectiveness of transitioning for these people. So in this survey, if you attempt suicide at age 18, go through transition, feel way better, and have your mental health completely improve, you would still answer yes, even though transitioning helped you during, it helped you. And so, but when you're answering the survey, you would still put a yes here.
So it's counting the suicides attempts that were before the treatment, is what you're saying?
No, it didn't take into, let's see. Okay. In addition, this is on page 3. In addition, the analysis was limited due to a lack of follow-up questions asked of respondents who reported having attempted suicide about such things as age and transgender/gender non-conforming status at the time of the attempt. I just read directly from that survey.
Okay.
So this study does not.
I may have misread the study, but from what I have in my notes, it was direct from that study. But I could be wrong. I may not have it in front of me. You have it in front of you, so I'm gonna concede that point to you and step back.
Wait, you cut out a little bit. I have a question. Was the point of the study that after transitioning, trans people are still their suicide rates are still higher than like the general population, or was the claim that transitioning doesn't help at all?
It wasn't that. It was not that transitioning doesn't help at all. It's that we're still seeing a high suicide rate. We're still seeing, and many studies don't show a decrease in the suicide rate from people who have had the sexual realignment or reassignment surgery versus people who haven't.
Okay, can you point to any study that says that?
Yes. Give me 1 second.
While you do that, so I have a study here from the Journal of Endocrine Society? No, Endocrine Reviews. Why can't I find this? Come on.
Really quick, if you don't mind me stepping back in really fast.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so that came from the Swedish study, which I've heard people try to debunk offhand. My problem is that research and the methods that they used were they weren't perfect, but it's hard to make perfect studies when we're talking about such a rare condition.
It's true, but also, again, this study does not say that. In fact, hold on, let me find it.
Then I must have that. I may have my links messed up because I have
that's a very common
pull. This is a very direct pull from it. Sorry.
No, that's fine. This is a very common study that's brought up in this reference, and the people who are reading that study and interpreting that point from it are not interpreting it correctly. So the survey is titled "Long-Term Follow-Up of Transsexual Persons Undergoing Sexual Reassignment Surgery." So I have it pulled up in front of me. Let's go. Things.
Are you saying that post-op, they do not have a high suicide rate?
No, they do, absolutely. But there's a couple things.
The general population, but that's not the that's not the proper control. Because if we're trying to
I understand. I 100% understand what you're saying. You're saying that we're trying to compare it against somebody who is transgender, who did not receive who did not receive hormone treatment or genital realignment. So God, I keep saying reassignment. So it continues to be too high of a suicide rate regardless. It shouldn't matter whether it brings it down a little bit.
Directly quoting from the study. In other words, the results should not be interpreted such as sex reassignment per se increases morbidity and mortality. Things might have been even worse without sex reassignment. The author of this study, Cecilia Dejani, I cannot pronounce that name, actually went on to co-author a meta-analysis showing that transitioning helps the well-being of trans people. This study does not point to that.
Hang on, can you say that one more time?
Which say what?
Can you say that last quote one more time?
In other words, the results should not be interpreted such as sex reassignment per se increases morbidity and mortality. Things might have been even worse without sex reassignment. I control F have been even and found that quote.
Might have based off of what?
Based on the interpretation that the authors had of this study.
Well,
is
and then
directly
there's also several other studies and meta-analysis showing that without sex reassignment surgery, trans people are worse off. I can cite you there's literally countless
Yeah,
that
we
I
got a lot
have
of them.
like
Yeah,
sitting
but then
right
I
in front
could,
of me. There
but
was
I
like
could
a
then I could
Yeah, sorry,
cite you that I could cite you that NHS study that the Birmingham University did, where they reviewed 100 of the follow-up studies for
Mhm.
post-op trans, and none of them, zero, concluded or that there was any conclusive evidence that gender reassignment was beneficial for the patient.
Well, and I would also
There's no
well,
conclusive
hold
evidence.
on, because that's a really slippery term, like conclusive
Yes,
evidence, right?
but you're also
that's yeah.
you're advocating for the changing of somebody's gender. I want to have conclusive
Right, okay,
evidence that
so
this is the correct
I
treatment.
can provide you. I'm not sure what you're citing, but I can provide some evidence that seems pretty conclusive to me. So, I mean, there was a 1990 meta-analysis published in the Annual Review of Sex Research examining 11 studies, concludes that transitioning yields positive results in the overwhelming majority of cases. That conclusion was replicated in 2007 in another meta-analysis of 18 studies, and was replicated again in 2018 in a meta-analysis examining 29 studies. There was also a 2010 meta-analysis published in Clinical Endocrinology examining 28 studies, which finds that gender transitioning alleviated gender dysphoria and improved quality of life in about 80% of cases. I mean, there's a 2016 meta-analysis published in the International Review of Psychiatry examining 38 studies and concludes that according to the data, the level of psychiatric disorders and psychopathology among trans people improves after transitional interventions. So I'm not exactly sure what you're citing here, but it seems like there's a lot of data suggesting that transitioning does improve the well-being of trans people. And I mean, you can say none of it's conclusive, and it's that's kind of a slippery term, but clearly based on the available data, we do have reason to believe that this is the case, seeing as how this is something that's been replicated so many times.
Well, see, I would just like to chime in a little bit because I would be instantly skeptical of a lot of those for one important reason. I want to go back to that quote that Jangles said for a minute. That is a very interesting quote. So he said, correct me if I'm wrong now, Jangles, but you said that it should not be interpreted, which by the way,
hold on. I didn't say that.
Right. But I'm saying you said as in you were the one who gave the quote, just for the record. That's all I mean. So the quote essentially says, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the evidence here should not be interpreted to mean that there is a greater morbidity after the fact.
Right.
So that's interesting because there's a few things. Number one, I don't think that people typically are supposed to be dictating what is or is not to be concluded. I think that's something that the evidence is supposed to do for itself. And then a scientist just actually puts down what the evidence suggests and then comes.
No, pretty much every research paper lists
data.
Conclusions.
Well, of course, they're always going to interpret it. That's not what I mean. But you shouldn't be sitting out there saying, well, I mean, one should not interpret this. If the evidence it leads to that interpretation, that is obviously what we should be interpreting. It kind of sounds
of course, but this even if.
But secondly, hang on though, I want to point out something. What do you mean by the data, the data indicating an increased morbidity? Because that almost sounds like what she's telling me is even though the data is showing a higher death rate, you shouldn't interpret it that way.
No, I think this points to a fundamental misunderstanding of how studies are supposed to be conducted. So if you're trying to say this study does provide clue, and it says it in the conclusions that yes, the suicide rates in Sweden from the years of I think 1970 to 1973. 1973 to 2003. Yes, the suicide rate among transgender individuals was much higher than that in the cis population. The study does say that. Right? About 19 times, yeah. Okay. But what the study does not say is that the surgery itself caused that increase. The control group was not trans people who didn't get the surgery. The control group was cis people matched for birth sex. So that's just a correct interpretation of how the study was conducted. Yeah. And again, this author went on to be the lead author of a meta-analysis that said as much that transitioning is enormously beneficial for trans people.
Yeah, can I interject something here? Because again, this is important because if the control group of the study is cis people and not trans people who didn't transition, you can't draw any conclusions based on that study about whether or not transition is good for trans people compared to if they didn't transition. And I know you said a little while back, which I was going to respond to, you said the fact that even though if the post-op suicide rate is lower than the pre-op suicide rate, The fact that it's not on par with the general population means that like it shouldn't be pursued. But that seems like really weird to me, because like if you're evaluating, say, like a cancer treatment, you're not going to say like, well, let's scrap it if it's not 100% effective. Like the issues facing transgender people are very complex. There's the issue of they have barriers when it comes to expressing themselves as in accordance with the gender that they identify as. There's the issue of just social stigma and parental acceptance, and et cetera. So the model which me and Jangles are applying here would not predict that suicide rates would suddenly be on par with the general population as soon as someone transitions. That's just a part of the larger approach that we'd take to making lives better for trans people.
Well, see, so I think there's multiple things that I kind of want to point out. So first off, I do have a quote here from a Birmingham University study. 100 follow-up studies of post-operative transsexuals that was actually summarized probably in the same Guardian article that that you had earlier, because that was actually where I originally found it. But obviously, you go in, find the study for itself. It says the Aggressive Research Intelligence Facility, which conducts review of healthcare treatment for the National Health Service, concludes that none of these studies provides, and they're looking at 100 different studies, right? Concludes that none of these studies provides conclusive evidence that transgender reassignment is beneficial for patients. It found that most research was poorly designed, which skewed the results in favor of physically changing sex.
Yeah, I know this. Yeah, I know this one. Can I because this, first of all, the most important thing to recognize is this was done in like the 1990s, and a lot of the data that Jangles and I are referencing comes like after that. So this analysis of the research isn't analyzing a lot of the research that Jangles and I are citing to prove our position, and that's like the main thing. Also, like I looked, you can't find the methodology of this study literally anywhere. Literally all that exists is a Guardian article about it, so there's really no way to like check the validity. So like I don't know how to like approach that. And there have been several studies after that analysis was released which overcome the methodological impediments that the Guardian article found in the existing research, which affirm the same conclusion. So that's not super relevant.
They didn't do that review of the studies though in the 90s. They did that.
Yeah, they did. In 1990, there was one of them. Now, I specifically like to quote that.
Well, the Guardian article was released in 2004. So, like, even then, a lot of the data Jangles and I are citing is after that, and it was specifically directed at overcoming the methodological impediments that Guardian article identified in the existing data.
Absolutely. And the problem with this, it seems, the research that I was doing, I found it hard to find good data from either side. Even when I looked at the most like heavily reviewed articles, it felt like it was being pushed in a certain direction. It feels that we have taken what was a mental disorder that we can treat, and we've turned it into just allowing. We've relaxed the standard on who we consider for these treatments.
I mean, you can feel like that if you want to, but couldn't we just say that any study that you find that says that it doesn't work was ideologically motivated as well?
Well, absolutely.
That doesn't really get us anywhere.
Let's look at something like referrals. Just look at something as basic as like referrals. Sure. I mean, would you agree that we've seen I think it's like a 20 time uptick in the amount of referrals that
and this isn't the first. And this isn't the first time this has happened. So, for example, there was a 13-fold increase in those seeking treatment for what was then known as gender identity disorder between 1974 and 1999. That was owed to the increased awareness and availability of that treatment. So, just because we see a large jump, that's perfectly fine. It could reflect an increased awareness.
Yeah. Also, I wanted to
reduce. What made it slow down?
What made it slow down? Well, presumably it didn't slow down. It jumped 13 times here and stayed kind of there, and then maybe jumped again.
Another thing is, I know you talk about how there's just like no good studies on the matter, But like this is kind of like, and talk about how a lot of it's probably ideologically motivated, but like this is the equivalent of if you were to give me like a logical argument and I were just to say like, no, that's wrong. Like you sort of have to engage with the methodology of the research in order to like prove that it's insufficient. And I mean, there was a recent study that Jangles actually sent me a while back when we were chatting about this. It was a massive 2019 Swedish total population study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And the study used random sampling. It was longitudinal, it was quantitative, had sufficient follow-up periods unlike previous studies. And it was like the sample size was literally the entire Swedish population.
Yeah, I was gonna say it was
so like
the whole
in
population,
summary, this study is literally as good as it can get when it comes to studying this issue. And it still concluded that transitioning had a positive effect on trans people and should be further pursued.
And what I just want to make it clear that I'm not saying that it is not a positive, that there aren't improvements to the lives of trans individuals once they go through these treatments. My problem is when I look at the data and I'm still seeing upwards of I think it's like 5 to 7% of all the people that get the surgery still end up attempting suicide, or that might be the actually commit suicide.
Well, yeah, because
rate.
they still face issues like, you know, stigma and lack of a family acceptance. So let's push for those too, so we can go the rest of the way.
Well, see, hang on. I think there's a few things here because we've been going on about a lot of this. First off, I want to say I think that both and are true about the studies, right? I think it's obvious that a lot of studies are ideologically motivated, and I think it's obvious that a lot of them aren't. So you really just got to take it study by study. There's no problem with quoting studies, and there's no problem with checking your sources, but we can just leave that there. I think that it's worthy of note, but nonetheless. The other thing I would point out, though, is that so we do have this, and I know, Jangles, you had already quoted this, the long-term follow-up of transsexual persons undergoing sex reassignment surgery cohort study in Sweden.
Yep.
Right, I'm going to go down here to the results. The overall mortality for sex reassigned persons was higher during follow-up than for controls of the same birth sex, particularly death from suicide. That's what the study actually says. And
that's what I said it said.
Right, but so in other words, what it is very clearly saying here is that there is a 19 times people who have the gender reassignment surgery, right? They're still 19 times more likely to be killing themselves than the greater population, as well as some other things. But to just quote here in the conclusion, our findings suggest that sex reassignment, although alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism and should inspire improved psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment for this patient group.
Absolutely. Do you want to know one of the reasons? Do you want to know one of the reasons that the author of the study said that? Because the overall mortality in their data sets was only significantly increased for the group operated on before 1989. Keep in mind when this data was collected. The study was published in 2011, but their data collection stopped in 2003. Right. So reading from the study, in accordance, the overall mortality rate was only significantly increased for the group operated before 1989. However, the latter might also be explained by improved healthcare for transsexual persons during the 1990s, along with altered societal attitudes towards persons with different gender expressions. This study in their data set, even though their overall data set showed a significantly higher rate, this wasn't uniform. And the later the surgery, the more societal attitudes improved and the better medical treatments got.
Yeah, and not only that, but like even taking your interpretation of the study, Jay, at face value, all the author is saying there is that even after transitioning, suicide rates in trans people are still higher than the general population. So just transitioning doesn't suffice as a solution for the harm, issues that transgender people face. We both fully admit that. That's why we're not advocating that the only solution to this is pushing for easier access to transitioning. Like I said before, the issues facing transgender people are incredibly complex and multifaceted. There's a lack of family acceptance, there's general stigma, there's discrimination in like healthcare and in legal systems and so on. So like, of course, me and Jangles aren't saying that.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Did you say healthcare? But did you say like outside of healthcare, outside of them not being able to just immediately walk in and get whatever they want? How are they being discriminated against?
Yeah, sure. So I can bring up a study I have on healthcare discrimination.
Quick though, I do just want to point out though, because what we're finding here, right? Because the indicator that I think or the indication I think that needs to be taken from this, if we're seeing sex reassigned people still have significantly higher suicide rates, which you've just informed me that you would, and of course have numerous times in this debate, that you would agree with, right? Then that indicates that there is a greater problem here, especially considering the fact that it's jumping from, I think 19 times the general populations would probably
Prior
be
to 1989.
27%, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, prior to 1989. That's important.
Right. All right. To be fair, though,
Is there newer
so
data?
you have that prior to 1989, right? But we know how means work and how medians work, right? That 14 years of data compared to the 16 years of data. First off, they're probably going to have more data as time goes on, because I imagine transitioning is happening more and more frequently as time is going on.
Yeah.
So, and that, of course, as anybody who looks at statistics knows, the more individual people you have, you tend to get more of a watered down sample, because that's just the way the societies go, right? For example, when you have 300 million people in the United States, it's going to be a different sample than if you have maybe 1.7 million people in the state of Idaho, right? So we do know that. And we also know, of course, that the way averages work means they're going to take into account the fact that there is that larger number of transitionings happening in that latter 14 years, right? And yet still we're coming to a conclusion here in the mean, in the average, right, that it's 19 times more likely than the average population. And what I'm saying is that indicates a problem that cannot be explained away just simply by problems with like what would you guys calling it, acceptance and things like that, right? Because
the study that you're citing the study you're citing for this data says exactly that. They said that the morbidity went down because of better societal attitudes and because of increased access to better healthcare.
Hang on, it might go down.
Study said this,
and even if it didn't,
down slightly, and even if it didn't, down by a significant margin, we're still seeing it being up by a very, very large margin. And the reason I'm saying that it can't be that it's not a proper explanation for that is because in any other group, we know, because we have many other groups who were treated significantly worse, right? Significantly worse, and they did not even come close to the suicide rate that we have. I think the highest suicide rate I ever heard was like a 26% from a study that I don't know if it was necessarily trustworthy, because I don't know how you could actually get the study or the suicide rate for Jews in the Holocaust, but it was saying there was a 26%.
So two things. Okay. So for one, you draw the conclusion that, the issue can't be explained away by just acceptance, based on data which showed that after transitioning, the suicide rate was still higher than the general population. But you can actually take that interpretation away from that data, because all that data shows is that transitioning, the medical process of transitioning, doesn't completely bring suicide levels down to the general population. It doesn't say anything about like a broader acceptance and like family acceptance, but that's not anything like that. So
that's not how medical effectiveness works, by the way.
Yeah,
like you can't determine something is medically effective only if it brings something things down. Like especially in mental health research, can you find me any sort of mental health?
Well, hang on though.
That brings symptoms down to the normal population.
I do have to get to the second thing that you said though, because so for one, based on that study, you can conclude that just transitioning isn't the whole like solution, but you can't say that acceptance broadly isn't the solution, because again, this study wasn't tracking like broad like societal acceptance or anything like that. And secondly, you bring up this point about like, well, groups that were treated worse, like Holocaust victims, had higher suicide rates. It's like, that's not really how suicide rates work. It's not like the worse off you are, the more likely you are to commit suicide. It's a complex sociological process. For example, people in poorer nations, like in more impoverished nations, tend to have lower suicide rates than people in richer nations. So this just goes to show like, it's not a matter of like the worse off you are materially, the more you should be accepted, or the more you should be expected to commit suicide. It's a complex sociological process that relates to things like family acceptance,
right?
And
but
so
that's
on.
I made clear to word myself very specifically though, so I do want to correct you here. It had nothing to do with the way you were materially. I said people who were treated significantly worse, right? We're talking about
very
special relationships.
But it's not even a matter
about Jews in the Holocaust. We're talking about Christians back in the places where Christians had been persecuted, so on and so forth. Homosexuals even back in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, so on and so forth, right? There is no study showing any evidence that anybody has come even close to that 41% number that is off-cited, which, by the way,
41% what? 41% what?
Suicide rate.
Nope. 41% attempted suicide rate. Those two things are extremely different.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that, fair enough. But I think that the
Yeah, but I feel, that feels
No,
nitpicky.
no, it's not. So, for example, who commits suicide more?
41%.
Hold on. Who
What are
commits
the
suicide?
rates?
Hold on. Who commits suicide more, men or women?
Men.
men.
Men
Right?
are about 70% of suicide completions. Who
Yeah.
attempts suicide more?
Women.
Women.
3 times more.
Women. About
That's-
a lot more. They're about
that's-
75. They're about 75% of suicide attempts. So no, suicide attempts and suicide completions are not.
What were the-
By the way,
And
what were the
another thing
rates?
is,
it's
what was the-
27%? Is that correct?
Another. Oh, sorry.
Really quick, what was the rate of attempted suicide in the other groups?
Oh, it's much lower. So no one is here is arguing that the attempted suicide rate is not much higher. I just wanted to,
Well, it feels like
to get
that's
your
what
number
you're-
correctly. I just wanted to get your number
Oh,
correct. It's not 41%
mind.
suicide rate. That's huge and that's damaging and incorrect.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Do you happen to know what
Mm.
the actual suicide rate is?
I think it's
not-
26 or 27%.
as
far as
it's
complete.
can you put some?
I don't think it's
give me
that
a
high,
source for
But
I've seen everything. If you range it out, I see like low 20s.
I wanted to
Would you agree
address
with
your
that?
point here, though. I don't know what the suicide rate is, so I can't really speak to that.
It's astronomical.
But
That's
the fundamental
it's-
point is here, what's the cause of that? Because Jay was saying, like, well, but people have been treated worse throughout history, and still they didn't have suicide rates as higher. Well, I mean, again, it's still more complex than that. For example, you have to take into account who is treating people in what way. For example, a lack of family acceptance is way more correlated with suicides than like a lack of
fair enough.
He's a
acceptance
but
from like sociological phenomenon. And so I think it's a little bit simplistic to just say, well, other people have been treated worse, so they should have higher suicide rates. And
Well,
if they
would you-
don't, then it's not because of stigma.
One sec, just to be sure that everybody heard it. I'm not sure if it was just me, but for me, it cut out. I think you had said, Mouthy, you were saying that compared to reduced acceptance by one's family as a predictor of suicide, you had mentioned another one in contrast, and that was where it faded out.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay. So basically, what I was saying is that, like, you can't just say that because one group is treated worse than another group, they should have a higher suicide rate, and to cite as like evidence that like stigma isn't the cause of like high trans suicide rates, because it's much more complex with that. You have to take into account a variety of things. You have to take into account who is treating those people badly. For example, like a lack of family acceptance is way more correlated with suicide than like a lack of classroom acceptance. You have to take into account how they're being treated badly by these different groups of people. I just think it's much more complex phenomena than just like the worse you're treated, the higher your suicide rate.
Something psychologists repeatedly look at. I'm sorry. Do you want to go ahead?
Well, I will be very quick. I just wanted to point out just the examples that I've used. If you notice, I mean, not all of them, of course. Like Jews in the Holocaust, of course, are going to be, their family is going to be other Jews in the Holocaust, right? I grant that. But people in interracial marriages, homosexuals, and people who are converting to a religion that is not necessarily the religion of the status quo are going to have that exact same problem. They're going to be rejected by their family. They're going to be rejected by people who love them, right?
Not
Especially
necessarily to
people
the
like
same
homosexuals, right?
extent.
Homosexuals have almost the exact same as far as the way they were treated in our society. Almost, I mean, let's be perfectly frank here, right? Like there was brutal assaults included, but not limited to gang rapes to try and rape people straight, quote unquote. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, and the suicide rate for gay people is still way higher than that of the straight population. Would you say
it is, but it is significantly lower than the transgender population.
All right, so something that psychologists look at when they're studying suicidal ideation is something called connectedness. And not just how you are treated or stigmatized by society, but how connected you feel within that society. So, for example, the reason the suicide rate wasn't astronomical during times of like slavery and Jim Crow was because Black people, in large part, still felt a sense of community with the people who were with them. So there's a study published in the that actually no, you didn't reference this in the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Mental Health called Transgender Youth and Suicidal Behaviors, applying the interpersonal psychological theory of suicides. And this gets at one of the premier theories of suicide that psychologists look at. So the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide. They found that perceived burdensomeness and thwarted belongingness, that gets back to the connectedness we were talking about, were significantly related to suicidal ideation and or suicide attempts. So it's not just being treated bad, it's how you feel connected to the people around you, especially your primary support structure, which for most people are going to be their family.
Again, though, would that
Yeah,
same thing not apply to homosexuals in the United States?
Yeah, let me respond to that, because like again, you keep bringing up like these examples of like, well, what about like homosexuals or what about transracial people? Like you would have to like actually present us data that like the lack of like acceptance was to the same extent among those groups and was coming from the same people in those groups and so on. Because if you can't actually like present us data on these relevant factors, then everything you're saying is just like pure conjecture. There's nothing scientific about this, or nothing we can draw actual like a strong scientific conclusion on.
If I could step
Well,
in
to
really
be
quick.
fair, I think a lot of those aren't necessarily going to have studies because they would depend on the past and with the area when we were actually in. Right.
Right,
I'm sure
so
you can
that's why
find
I'm saying you
studies on
can't make this
homosexuality
claim.
and transracial. But for example, things like the persecution of Black people in slavery days, I'm not 100% sure that we were actually counting suicide of Black people back in the
Probably
days of
not,
slavery.
unfortunately.
Right, and yet
But with that
there
being
isn't
said,
data,
though, I
and
mean,
that's why I'm
one of
saying you
those
can't
things
make
that's
this
a
claim.
commonly known fact, right? I may not have the study in front of me, but you and I both know, in fact, you probably made the argument before that homosexuals were rejected by their family, by their friends, by their class, by their society,
Yes,
by
but
everybody,
you'd
right?
have to, but again,
As
you'd
were
have to
transracial people.
but again, you'd have to show me that they're being like rejected to the same extent by the same demographics in the same proportion to one another. There's a lot of, again, like there's so many complex factors that go into this that unless you can like actually like present data controlling for all these variables and stuff, this is just like pure conjecture. Like this is really nothing to go off of.
I think
To be
Todd
fair,
wanted to
it's
get in a while back.
pure
Hold on.
conjecture
I
that
think
you're
I
saying
think
theirs is
Todd
higher
wanted to get in back.
Oh yeah, sure.
Really quick, I was just gonna step to say the issue I have right now is I'm not trying to dig my heels in on, if this is the correct treatment and this is the correct way to help improve trans people's lives, then so be it. And I hope that we can go forward and make positive changes and make the make it a better society for them. However, we take a step back. For me, it takes a step back for me when we start talking about children and when we start talking about kids. So if we want to step away from the suicide rate and what is happening to trans individuals at post-op, I just don't think we're getting anywhere.
Yeah,
I just feel
okay.
like we
We can
keep
do that.
going back.
let's
and
do we can do puberty blockers if you want,
Sorry,
if that's like what you wanted to focus on with children.
it's not even just puberty blockers. It's really just like even the stigmatization and the normalization of trans pushing that onto children is, I think, not a good thing. I would be much more.
Why?
I'm much more inclined to defend the position of we shouldn't normalize the transition for children than I am adults. I don't care what an adult does.
I
Well, to
question,
be fair,
hold on,
like,
what does it
yeah.
count as something being pushed onto children? What is the distinction between being taught and being pushed?
And again, I know the argument will be made like just because something has been done for a long time does not make it right. But for all of human history, we did not take children and start giving them either puberty suppressants or adding hormones to their body. I think the only logical thing that you can do when you have a child that is, has gender confusion is to socially transition them. I don't see any reason that you would start implementing anything other than just affirming their gender.
Can I give you like a couple of reasons?
Yeah.
So I think that some of the reasons that it might be good to allow trans kids to take puberty blockers is because, and this is the distinction we have to make, because you said trans children shouldn't be transitioning. I agree with that. But puberty blockers are not transitioning. They're the opposite. They're just blocking the puberty that they would otherwise be going through. And the reason that I think it's good for children to be able to go on puberty blockers if they see strong, persistent gender dysphoria is because, for one, if you don't go on puberty blockers and you grow up as an adult and you are still transgender, as an adult transgender, it's going to be a lot harder to actually transition and express yourself as the gender that you identify as, because certain characteristics develop with puberty that are really hard to do away with if you've already gone through that puberty. And secondly, even like disregarding how it's going to affect them when they're adults, also in the moment. Not giving a kid puberty blockers if they have strong gender dysphoria is just delaying treatment for this psychological issue that they have. And delaying treatment in transgender children has been correlated with higher rates of depression, worse psychological functioning, higher suicidal ideation. There's a large body of research to suggest that the use of puberty blockers increases the well-being of trans people while being pretty safe and effective. And I could send you some of these studies.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'd like to see again,
Here's one.
I'm not
Here's one.
here to dig my heels in on any study. If I am presented with evidence to the contrary, I'm going to change my mind. But out of curiosity, how many kids with gender dysphoria end up maintaining that after adolescence?
We almost have no idea, because a lot of the studies, so for example, you might have heard like the 60 to 90% desistance rate before. A lot of those studies just do not say anything close to what they say they do. Like I went over, so for example, Dr. James Cantor created a resource that I saw quoted around a lot. It was a list of 11 studies, and almost all of them, like 7 out of those 11, were published before 1987, at a time when most Americans thought that same-sex relationships should not be legal. So society was much, much different then. And a lot of the rest of them like didn't, if they counted desisting as going to a gender clinic and then not wanting treatment. That's counted as desisting, but that's not how desisting works. You cannot desist from a thing from which you were not diagnosed. So if you go into a gender clinic, was found you didn't have gender dysphoria and then just went home and didn't come back, you're not a desister.
Yeah. Also,
They counted that in that study
in the a couple 30, of studies, yeah.
In the 10 to 30%.
I actually. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
You cut out. Sorry. I thought you weren't talking, but you were, because my audio is
sorry.
Yeah. But so I actually do sort of have kind of an answer. There was actually a study that John Doyle brought up in one of his videos, which actually sort of confirmed Jangles and I's position. Which found that, well, for one, it found that puberty blockers were effective at emotional problems as well as depressive symptoms in trans youth, decreased with the usage of puberty blockers. Oh,
do you say they were
can you hear me?
It for a second.
Behavioral. I have the same study pulled up.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so it basically found that behavioral and emotional problems as well as depressive symptoms in trans youth decreased with the usage of puberty blockers, while general functioning improved significantly. And here's a point that's relevant, because you were asking like how many people like decide they don't want to be trans anymore, which is that none of, they said in the study, none of the trans youth who started puberty blockers didn't go on to take cross-sex hormones. And they said, quote, "The finding supports earlier studies showing that young adolescents who had been carefully diagnosed show persisting gender dysphoria." And so this is another issue, because a lot of people like to cite studies where they're like, oh, look, all these trans people decided they weren't trans later on in their lives. But the problem is these aren't people who would have been diagnosed by good doctors with gender dysphoria in the first place. There was an analysis released by the Impact program, actually, which found that you can actually see like noticeable differences in the behavior and in answers to surveys between children who are just gender expansive and who would not go on to be transgender, and children who actually have gender dysphoria and will go on to be transgender for basically like their entire lives. And when you can carefully select for that, you find that when you like carefully diagnose kids with gender dysphoria, you find that there's basically none who don't go on to
none
still be transgender. Yeah.
Can you, where is there a study to show that there's none?
Yeah, I mean,
well, in this study there was none. I said basically none,
dude.
Well, I said basically none. Of course, there's never going to literally be none. I said there was none.
No. Even if it was like 5%, I would be blown away.
No, I said, I'm sorry. I thought I said basically none. I would never make the claim that like there's literally none.
No, I know you didn't say zero. But right. Even it being an incredibly low number, just I find that very hard to believe.
Well, that's what this study suggested.
Well, see, and I would also point out too that I would definitely question a lot of the information that you had just given there in that study, and even the study itself. I'd like to see how it was conducted, because we don't even just decide mental disorders like bipolar and schizophrenia and things like that in children until they're like 17 years old. Right.
But we know what our gender identity is. We develop a gender identity by the time we're 2 or 3.
Say that again.
We develop a gender identity by the time we're about 2 or 3. That's what all the research says. It's one of the first lenses through which we view the world. So gender identity is a very early adaptation that we have. In fact, I have a study called Gender Cognition in Transgender Children, published in Psychological Science in 2015, that found that that provided evidence that in in development, transgender youth are statistically indistinguishable from cisgender children of the same gender identity. So this is something that kids identify with and can be pretty persistent with.
I mean, I would just absolutely have to check the background of that study, because I just flat don't believe that. That makes absolutely no sense.
Sure,
There is
I'll
no
send the DOI
way,
to you.
absolutely. Hang on, I just need to say that there's absolutely no way that a 2 to 3 year old child who is literally in some instances not even capable of forming words, you know what I mean? There's no way that person has actually got a full and complex gender identity. It doesn't even make any sense.
Well, you can feel that way.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be full.
But like there are kids that go from playing, they're little girls that start their young life playing with trucks, and then by the time they're 13 they grow out of it. Like you're
Cool.
saying, you are saying that is a unlikelihood. And it's just not. It's throughout human history, that's how it's always happened. Is that how you think
the study was conducted? That like they found a bunch of girls who like trucks?
No. I'm giving a one-off. No, I'm just giving a terrible analogy, but I just find it hard to believe that a child's gender identity is set at 2. Boom.
Set is a hard way.
We don't let children make any decisions on their own. Okay? I mean, a young girl can't even go get her.
I don't even care about decisions. You're saying their brain is 2 years old. It's 23 years of development, and you're going to say that their gender identity is set then?
I didn't say it was set.
That's exactly my point, right? We're sitting here in a society where people argue that you shouldn't even have people like sleeping around with people at the ages of 18 and 20 because they're not complex enough to understand that sex makes babies. And yet we're going to sit here and argue that we have a full and complex understanding of gender identity.
Both of you keep saying this full and complex understanding, and that's not what either of us said, and that's not what the research says at all.
You said the gender identity is established at 2 or 3.
A rough idea of it, yes. Now ask a 3-year-old. Find a niece or nephew if you don't have any kids of your own. Ask them if they think they're a boy or a girl. Most of them will have some sort of idea. I told you, gender identity is not something invented by trans people or only applicable to trans people. All of us have gender identities. Kids have gender identities, whether they're cis, trans, or something else. Like, it's the first lens through which we view the world in a societal format.
I'd also like to bring up, like, you guys can say that, like, you feel this way, like you really feel like, you know, trans kids who are given puberty blockers would have otherwise like changed at some point, but that's just not what the data suggests. Like I just gave a study showing that that's just not the case.
I would want to actually see that data and go over that for myself, because I know a lot of people can interpret the data to say a lot of things.
And I mean, again, the authors of the study cited other studies, and because the direct quote was that this confirms previous studies, it says the finding supports earlier studies that young adolescents who had been carefully diagnosed showed persisting gender dysphorias, and they cited like other studies showing this. So there's a variety of studies actually which show that when carefully diagnosed, gender dysphoria is persistent.
Yeah, I understand that you're saying that, but if I ask Steven Crowder the same thing, he's going to tell me something different. So that's why I'm saying, like, I would be...
let him cite a study for you.
Well, okay, here's the hilarious part. Steven Crowder actually cited the study I'm giving you in a video. That's where I, like, both Hunter Avallone, or not Hunter Avallone, I like Hunter Avallone, John Doyle, the evil Hunter Avallone, and Steven Crowder both cited this study, both in an attempt to show that if you give kids puberty blockers, it makes them trans, whereas they otherwise would have changed their gender identity. But the authors of the study that they both cited without actually reading the study said that the reason there was no desisters is because the gender dysphoria was carefully diagnosed, and that this is in continuation and confirms the already established conclusions of previous studies examining whether or not gender dysphoria is persistent when carefully diagnosed.
Okay, so just ask me, I got a question then. Why is it that, because you keep saying carefully diagnosed, I mean, people carefully diagnose things. I mean, we like I said, we don't even diagnose people with other sort of psychological phenomenon until well into their either pubescent or post-pubescent years.
That's
not true.
Right? That is true. It is absolutely positively, as a matter of fact, true.
Autism, ADHD, depression and anxiety.
Those are
all
things
these things can be.
Those are actually, you can see like the physical, because the difference between somebody who has autism, somebody who has schizophrenia, is that the autistic person is actually typically shown to have either heightened or in many cases lowered motor capacity, right? You could argue that it's a physical detriment, whereas we don't really know the specifics behind things like schizophrenia and things like that. So that's a completely different thing. Things like ADHD, there's arguments about ADHD, whether or not it even exists. So I'm not going to get into that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about mental illness.
Like I said. That's
the thing about mental illness. It all has to do with medicalization and like how your functioning is impacted in your environment. So you might make the argument that ADHD isn't a real mental illness, but that's kind of meaningless. Like, does this impair your functioning in your day-to-day life in your society? If so, we can classify it as a mental illness.
Well,
I mean, ADHD definitionally is a mental illness.
But by that classification of mental illness, that absolutely includes.
Well, if you
no, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
Yes, it
Actually,
does. It
does.
really going to make the argument that it doesn't impair their day-to-day life. They literally mutilate themselves and are attempting suicide at a 4 out of 10 rate. Are you kidding?
I got it. Hold on. Can you see this? I got an industrial piercing. Do I have a mental illness because I mutilated myself? What is that definition?
Yeah. Also, like
I mean, by that same argument, I cut my foot off.
Hold on.
It's just a bar. Obviously, you know the difference. It's intrinsically
yeah,
obvious.
Let me just say this. So you talk about how it's something that impairs like day-to-day functioning. That's the definition of mental illness, and trans people are therefore mentally ill by that definition. That's actually not a completely precise definition. The APA actually has a page where they talk about whether or not being transgender is a mental illness, and they define what a mental illness is, and then explain how being transgender is not a mental illness. Because the thing is, it's not just if something impairs your day-to-day functioning, that's a mental illness. It has to be that, like, is the cause of that impairment. And in the case of trans people, we know that the suffering that they experience primarily arises in response to things like stigma and discrimination and harassment. And so the being transgender actually isn't inherently the cause of
the actual mental
impairment.
illness. The actual mental illness is known as gender dysphoria. And if you're
not
going to
all
appeal,
trans people have it.
Yeah, exactly. If you're going to appeal to mental illness, you're going to have to cite the reputable organizations that define mental illness for us. And when you do that, you're going to be really interested in finding out what they recommend to treat gender dysphoria.
For the record, I would quickly point out, just because I knew that this would come up, I'm going to go ahead and pull up the definition right now because I did have it up here. I would quickly point out, however, that in the DSM-4, this is going to be different. So if we are just going to strictly just go by what these people are saying, then obviously...
Yeah, but why would you go by DSM-4 definitions when we have the DSM-5, which is like...
Okay, but that's exactly my point, though.
Updated.
So was the DSM not trustworthy during the 4, or was it all of a sudden trustworthy during the 5?
Wait, it's not about...
We just so happen to have ideological
It's not about...
people,
No. It's not about being trustworthy. It's about the fact that scientific models change over time in light of new data.
Well, I got the definition here from the DSM-5. It says a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental function. That is absolutely something that would include gender dysphoria and transgenderism. Absolutely.
Okay, hold on. Then why don't they say the second one and only say the first one? In fact, and why would they recommend people with gender dysphoria transition to alleviate it?
Yeah.
If you trust their definition, hold on. If you trust their definition,
contradictory things numerous times.
If you trust their definition enough to use it, why would you not trust their treatment recommendations? That doesn't make any sense to me.
And let me bring up another point here.
That's not true at all. I can deduce whether or not you don't have a foot. That doesn't mean I know the best way to make a prosthetic.
Wait, hold on. So you appealed to the DSM definition. Here is a quote from the American Psychological Association, which publishes the DSM. So this is the authority. So this is the authority that you're appealing to right now. And they say, quote, a psychological state is considered a mental disorder only if it causes significant distress or disability. Many transgender people do not experience their gender as distressing or disabling, which implies that identifying as transgender does not constitute a mental disorder. For these individuals, the significant problem is finding affordable resources such as counseling, hormone therapy, medical procedures, and the social support necessary to freely support their gender identity and minimize discrimination. So if you want to appeal, if you want to appeal,
hold on one sec, CJ.
If you want to appeal to the authority of the American Psychiatric Association, there they were explicitly disagreeing with you.
Hold on, I'm not even appealing to their authority. In fact, more of what I am actually saying, because if you notice, I did point out the DSM is going to disagree. The DSM-4 is going to disagree with the DSM-5, and we do need, because they literally directly call it a mental disorder in previous DSMs, and then contradict themselves in DSMs that have come
It's
out.
not, it's not a
So I fully
contradiction.
acknowledge that.
It's
My
not a
point in quoting
contradiction.
the
Scientists
DSM
update their models
Yeah,
with
I
in light of
understand
new
that, but my
information.
point in quoting the DSM was simply to say that even by the definition of people who do not agree with me, this is absolutely something that is a mental disorder. There's no.
When
it's
you say
not.
this,
no
when you say
evidence.
this, what do you mean? When you say this, what do you mean?
The idea that you are a different biological sex than you are, whatever, I don't know.
That
what
is not the
exactly you call
definition of gender dysphoria. You're not even close to your definition there.
that. Either
and
way,
again-
quite frankly, I don't necessarily care what the specific definition is. Everybody knows what I'm talking about, right?
Well,
When
we need
people
to
No, we
understand
don't.
one.
convinced that they are a different gender and they go out of their way to transition, quote unquote, to this other gender as if such a thing is possible when it is not,
It
right?
absolutely is.
That is a mental disorder. That is a
Okay.
severe mental disorder. It causes
So-
people to severely mutilate themselves. It has obvious, very obvious psychological traumas that are associated with things like suicide, depression, drug use, so on and so forth.
All right, so we're going back to all that like stuff that we
Stigma,
demonstrated
but
empirically isn't
every
true.
other group that has ever had a stigma on it has never come close to these rates.
All
That
right.
doesn't make
Okay.
any sense.
We've
All
talked
right,
about all this
we'll
already.
switch
hey,
it.
Todd, do you want to talk? I'm sorry, you've been quiet for a while.
No, you're fine. I'm just, again, this is not my field of expertise by any
Sure.
means. So
Sure.
I'm really just, I'm learning just along with this whole conversation. However, what I'll say is I'm just curious. You keep saying that there's empirical data. There's empirical evidence of all of this. I will want to just see that data. I'm just
I
curious
have
because
21 studies
it
for
really
you.
does it
We both
contradicts
have- yeah.
when you start doing research and you start looking for, you're looking to affirm your position, you find these same talking points over and over and over again. So I don't know.
Right.
From everything that I read, there's a incredible lack of evidence, and when it comes to kids, like we said, you weren't saying to transition them, but to put them on puberty puberty suppressant wouldn't be a big deal. But I'm just curious, are there no side effects to like suppressants? Because I have here adverse effects on bone mineralization,
Right. So
compromised fertility.
right.
To
so,
me, that would be just enough right there. Data on the effects of the brain haven't really been established.
So okay, so there's a few things to go over here. So for one, like before we pivoted to, I don't mean pivot is like a pejorative, but like before we like move away from the previous topic, I just wanted to talk about this transgender mental disorder thing one more time, because Jay said that by the definition of people that he doesn't agree with, transgenderism is still a mental disorder, and the people he disagrees with that he was referring to is the APA. But I literally gave quotes from the APA where they explicitly said that by their definition, being transgender is not a mental disorder. And again, when it comes to things about like other groups have been
but
treated
they do
worse, this is just
classify
much more
gender
complex than
dysphoria.
that. Yes,
Yeah.
but not all trans people have gender dysphoria. Would be my point.
Absolutely, but aren't the ones that are going to be going through a transition and the ones that are facing the most, the highest levels of problems, the ones with gender dysphoria?
Probably.
Probably, yeah, for the most part.
Okay, so
yeah.
I feel like that should probably be where, I'm not saying all the focus, and obviously there are going to be exceptions to that rule, but it feels like what
Yeah.
he was saying is that gender dysphoria is the mental illness.
Right. Well, he did say being
He
trans,
said
like to
being
be
trans
fair.
is mentally
But
ill.
yeah, so we can
What
move
is
on
your
from that.
what is something outside of gender dysphoria that would line up in that category then?
Right.
for you?
So being trans is just having a gender that doesn't align with the sex you were born with. And gender dysphoria is like an intense state of psychological despair
Like distress
as a
yeah.
result of that. So it's sort of a different thing. Like you can be trans without having gender dysphoria. So yeah, being trans isn't necessarily a mental disorder. But
Really
we can
quick,
sort of
you just kept saying trans though. I'm curious, outside of gender dysphoria,
There's a direct
What
parallel
are
to be made. There's a direct parallel to be made, especially the APA, if we're talking about the American Psychiatric Association, with homosexuality. So in 1973, the APA proposed removing homosexuality from its list of disorders, and they proposed replacing it with something called sexual orientation disturbance. And that's really, really close if we're talking about parallels to going from like gender identity disorder to like gender dysphoria. So it was a mental illness to be a homosexual because it interfered with your life because based on these clinicians' understanding of what it meant to function in society, homosexuality fell outside of that. And that's how we move. Go ahead.
Sorry. Is there an argument to be made, though, that I'm sorry, I got lost on listening to you. I apologize.
I talk fast. I'm sorry. I'm
no,
sorry.
You're fine.
I talk fast.
Finish your point. Sorry about that.
I was basically done. I said that there are a lot of parallels. Of course, it's not the same thing, but there are a lot of parallels to how we treated homosexuality in the way we treat transgender people today.
I'm sorry, I did remember. So when we talk about sexual orientation, does trans fall into sexual orientation? Because to me, that's a tightrope to walk.
It's not the same thing, but they're related, if that makes sense.
Does it have a direct impact on your sexual orientation, though? Just because you think really, I haven't seen gender.
Well, if you're a trans woman and you like women, you're a lesbian, so that changes your sexual orientation. So in that way, I have some studies.
But that's just a label. That's just a label. But okay,
of course,
go ahead.
Well, I do have some studies.
Can I just provide like a study for what Todd was asking for? Because he asked me for a study on like the idea that puberty blockers are like safe and effective. He brought up fertility and bone density. The fertility and the bone density thing I'm actually very familiar with. But the thing that's important about that is that while puberty blockers can have some minuscule effect on bone density while people are on puberty blockers, this is something that goes away after the person stops taking puberty blockers. And this was confirmed by a 2013 study by the Endocrine Society. And then as far as sterilization, the issue isn't that puberty blockers make you sterile. That's actually a confusion between puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. Puberty blockers don't make you sterile. But if you go on to cross-sex hormones after taking puberty blockers, then you will become sterile. So that's that.
Hypothetically, but isn't the suspension, hypothetically, obviously this is not how the treatment would work, but if you suspend puberty, you can't do that indefinitely, correct?
Yes.
So hypothetically,
puberty
there
blockers
is
aren't
we're,
like
we're still working with a time frame.
Yeah,
so
puberty
you
blockers
are
aren't
taking a risk.
Thing.
Yeah, I know they aren't, but by adding them, you are taking some level of risk of sterilizing yourself.
Oh, what's the risk?
It would sterilization by delaying puberty, correct?
Well, no, because you only become sterile if you go on to take cross-sex hormones. But there is no existing data to suggest that if you take puberty blockers for any amount of time, that's going to in itself make you sterile. There was an Endocrine Society study which basically found that which finds that this isn't really the case. So this doesn't necessarily seem to be true.
Yeah, I'll look into it. I'm just curious because the point that seems to get driven home is that those three side effects of the puberty suppressant, and they purposefully do not say hormones. They're talking about puberty suppressing puberty. So I'm just.
Yeah, well, that's just some contradictory data that I'm familiar with. Yeah. It seems like this definitely isn't something that's been replicated at all, because I have a bunch of studies that seem to show that there is no long-term impact on sterilization or bone density when it comes to taking puberty blockers.
You'd also have to prove that a reduction in bone density would be a problem. Like, you can have plenty strong bones with let's say a 5% reduction in bone density. That would be statistically significant and worth reporting in a study, but it still might not result in any sort of long-term negative outcomes for kids. So there's an extra step you would have to go.
We do want to go to Q&A pretty quick here.
Okay, sorry about that.
Once somebody, if someone's willing to defer to giving the other side the last word, we won't assume it means that you don't have an answer. Don't worry about that. We know you've got another round in the chamber ready to fire, but just for the sake of getting to these questions, and I have to say, this has been an awesome debate. It has been very thought-provoking, really great to listen to. So I hope everybody else out there has enjoyed it as much as I have. And also, yes, I'm so glad that we've had people say, hey, I would love to come on and debate. We would love to have you. Like I said, no matter what walk of life you're from, absolutely love to have you. And so with that, by email, by the way, in case you didn't catch it, for those that I did give it to in chat, is moderndaydebate@gmail.com. So feel free. Would love to hear from you. And then Super chats. Jeremy T, thanks so much, said, CJ, what scientific law says males cannot wear dresses?
I mean, there's no scientific law that says anything about what you can or cannot wear. I mean, there's scientific, facts about, like, for example, if you wear no shirt or a bikini or something like that, you might be more susceptible to sun cancer. But I guess that's not really like a dictating what you can or cannot wear, right? It's just saying what may or may not be a good idea, and of course sunscreen will help with that anyways. But I think the question is kind of just a little bit ridiculous, honestly.
Gotcha. And so sorry about my mic, folks. It's been really weird tonight, so I'm working on it now. Appreciate your feedback in the chat. That definitely helps, as I have no idea what's going on with the mic. It's not normally like this, but we're gonna make it. Next, thanks for your super chat from Nella Dower. Says, yes, it's a conclusive that transitioning improves outcomes for trans people. I'm living proof. So I think this came up in the debate. But we'll give you a chance if you'd like to respond.
I would just simply say, and I don't say this at all to discredit anything, I'd more say it just to make the point as strongly as I can. I've met people personally who believe that hardcore drugs has improved their mental state. It doesn't mean it has. And I'm not comparing this person directly to being a hardcore drug addict.
In this case, their claim is actually like directly backed up by all of the data.
Yeah, it's not just an anecdote. In fact, we wouldn't. Awesome for her or him.
Yeah.
Which one was it? I couldn't remember. Awesome for them, but we wouldn't use this one person as definitive proof. That's why we had their studies.
Their anecdote just has to be backed up by longitudinal, like quantitative studies.
And we are going to. I can give you the last word for the team who the super chat was directed toward, just so we don't gang up on you, and then we got to go to the next one. Pithy last response from you guys, and then we got to, if you want, you don't have to.
Go ahead, Todd.
I was just gonna say I didn't want to be a dick, but yeah, anecdotal. And I mean, there are obviously going to be post-op transgender people who are unhappy with their surgery. So.
Layman, thanks for your super chat. Said, good job, Jangles and Mouthy Infidel. You guys have a fan out there. And P. Barnes, thanks so much. P. Barnes said, we're debating whether accepting someone for who they are will impact their well-being. Am I awake?
I mean, I guess I would just simply disagree with the premise. I mean, that's my problem with this, is that's not who you are. You might believe that, but it isn't true.
Right? Are you a linguistic realist?
There's obviously the intersex, but like that's a disorder, right?
Are you a linguistic realist?
Say again?
I'm sorry, are you a linguistic realist?
A linguistic, I guess I'm not 100% familiar with the term.
Yeah, so my point is that if you're going to say that, like, if you're a linguistic realist, then that means that you believe definitions are like dropped down from like the sky or something and are just like intrinsic. If you're not a linguistic realist, because it's a completely untenable position, then you must believe that definitions are just things that apply to, like, words are just things that we use to communicate with each other. And if you understand that that's what words fundamentally are, then any definition of the term woman based on like chromosomes or like biology is going to be untenable, because that's not how we use the term woman, because you can't see someone's chromosomes in any social setting.
I mean, I feel like that wouldn't necessarily be something that I could take an either or position on. I mean, on one end, obviously we invented the word man, right? It didn't come down from on high.
Before
or anything like that.
chromosomes.
On
Or
the other
after
end, though, we
chromosomes.
had a very, like, there's a clear definition of the word man, and everybody in this room knows exactly what I mean when I say the word man.
Right, but I could tell you that I have XX chromosomes in like a vagina right now, and like I have been taking testosterone. Now, of course, that's not the case, but it could be, and you've assumed I'm a man for that entire debate, and that's my entire point. Is that we don't refer to like a man or woman in the like biological sense that you're defining it in any social setting. So it's impractical to say that that's the definition,
But
because it's not. That's
that
not
doesn't
how we
make
understand
you a
it.
man, though.
But it is.
Just because I
If
evaluate you as a man, or I judge you as a
But
man.
it does.
That doesn't make no, it doesn't.
But I think it does,
No, it
because
doesn't.
the definition of a word, unless you're a linguistic realist, is going to be determined by how people tend to use it. And if people tend to use man, not referring
Can people
to
use
biology
words incorrectly? Can people
well,
use
no.
words
If
incorrectly?
if everybody's using a word incorrectly, then they're not using it incorrectly. That's my point, because
I hate to.
words are determined by how people use them.
Oh no.
We do have to move on to the next
Yeah, but-
question. I can give you,
sure.
because the super chat was targeting CJ and Richard. I can give you guys the last word if you want to make a quick and pithy response, and then we got to move to the next one.
I mean,
I'm gonna
I
think
would
further.
just simply say that we know, what we know what we mean when we refer to the word man. Of course, we invented the word man as humans, but it does have a set definition that we all agreed upon, and it describes the masculine of the two sexes.
Next up, thanks for your super chat from Merlin72001 says, wish anti-trans rights people would just be honest. Trans people make you uncomfortable. It doesn't make you evil, just a bigot.
I
love
appreciated
the,
the
like-
dramatic reading.
Yeah,
I
that
absolutely.
was like-
See, this is
That
the
was good.
here's the problem. I absolutely do not want to get, and I don't think Jay over here wants to do it either. Get lumped into this idea of thinking that we think transgender people are evil. I'm looking at it from a place of compassion and wanting to make sure that they are given the correct treatment and we're taking the right steps at the right pace and not rushing to something just because society is saying it's the correct thing to do.
Yeah, for what it's worth, from what I wrote down of your opening statement, you said that society has taken good steps in improving the lives of trans people, and that's good. We want to improve their mental well-being. So I would definitely not call you a bigot. But what I've hoped that we've demonstrated is that all the empirical data that we've been able to gather, including 5 meta-analyses from me, a bunch of studies from Mouthy that obviously I don't know, exactly what they
Yes,
are.
I can't wait to review them.
Yeah, cool.
We
Yeah,
can-
I just haven't been able to see it yet. You know what I mean?
sure. I'll post it in the Twitter chat when we're done here. Okay.
Absolutely.
CJ, if you want a quick chance to respond, and then we'll move to the next one.
I mean, I would just quickly say, I mean, everybody at this point has been, being a conservative, I'm not going to lie, I'm called a bigot once every 5 seconds. So the word has virtually no meaning to me anymore. I say that a little tongue in cheek, of course. I know there's real bigots, but look, my view on transgenderism is essentially that I believe it is cruel to take a mentally ill population and to basically go out of your way to say that their delusions are justified or somehow valid. That doesn't mean that they are not valid. It means that the delusions that they have are not valid. And I also think that when people say you believe I'm not a valid person because you think I have a mental disorder, I mean, that is a horrible view of the schizophrenic, the bipolar, and etc., right? To think that we just invalidate them because they're mentally ill. It's not true at all.
Next up, Nella. I hate to interrupt you, just to keep it short and pithy. Nella Dower, thanks for your super chat, who said, facts don't care about your feelings, Richard. Next up, Matra J. Disco, thank you for your question. They said, how come all the anti-trans data is from 1967? Is that true?
I mean,
I think it might have been like a.
most of the studies that I found were late 2000s, early 90s, but I was also under the impression that data is hard to collect when we're trying to, look at, time frames of 30, 40 years.
Gotcha. And thanks for your statement from Mothra J. Disco strikes again. Says, trans women are valid women regardless of your bias. Next up, thanks for your...
True.
Next up,
I'm
we get
sorry, I
owned
have to
with
stress
facts
that
and
it isn't correct.
Merlin72001. I can let you keep going if you want to say more, but otherwise I'll keep going.
No, it's just it's no, I don't. It'd be redundant essentially. I'm just saying. There are biological facts we need to
I'm sorry.
acknowledge.
Where do you think definitions come from?
Hold on, I'm not. That's a ridiculous semantic argument because I know where
No,
you're
it's
going.
not.
You're saying we made the
We're
definition,
talking about
so on and so
semantics.
forth, right?
No,
we're
no,
talking about semantics.
Yeah.
No, we're not though. We're talking about the
We
concept
are.
behind the semantics, right? We know when we are describing a male, right? We didn't understand chromosomes, but it just so happened that it was amazing scientific coincidence, if that's what you believe, that what we described as a man could be linked to the XX chromosome, or is it the XY? I guess I'm not 100%.
Not without fail, no.
Not without fail.
Because
Right.
again,
I
there's
mean,
going to be
There's
people
plenty of things
who
that happen
there's going to be
without fail.
people
You can
who
get skin cancer.
no,
That
no,
doesn't mean that
wait,
your
hold on,
skin
hold on.
isn't
You can
objectively skin or
you
something
can
along those
no,
lines, right? That's not
because
the same
you can
thing.
find
Plenty
people.
of things fail.
You could find people who look like males who is somebody who anybody would describe as a man who doesn't have those chromosomes. So that's simply not true. That's not a valid way to define that word.
I've got to give
not a man.
give CJ a response for this one, and then we've got to keep moving. We got to go a little bit faster just because we're a little over time. So go ahead, CJ, if you want to respond, and then we'll move to the next question.
I would just simply point out that saying that intersex somehow disproves the rule is absurd on its face. Something is
That's what I was
not
talking
disproven by a problem or a chink in the chain. Right?
is
In
next.
fact, that's-
Thanks for your question from Merlin72001 says, CJ bringing up out-of-date papers to support his already held position based on his past ahistorical and anti-scientific positions and arguments in other debates is adorably ironic.
I mean, you can't really have a scientific position on whether or not Confederate statues should come down, so I guess I'm not sure what they're referring to as far as
Next.
my past debates here.
You got it. Maynard Saves, thanks for your question. Said, fool enough to almost be it, cool enough to not quite see it, doomed. Pick your pockets full of sorrow and run away with me tomorrow, June. Thank you very much. Is
What?
that... I'm only thinking fool enough to almost be it. I don't know. I think it's music lyrics, but I don't remember what it would be. Nella Dower, thanks for your question. Says, Rich just, quote, feels, unquote, people are pushing it on kids. Okay? My feelings. I added that last part, sorry.
At least, at bare minimum, 20 times more referrals and a drastic decrease in the mean age of those referrals.
Gotcha. And I forgot to mention, Christina, saw you subscribed. Thanks so much. As well as Porktown Biker and Fatal Animal. Really thrilled to have you with us. Welcome. And next super chat from Taliesin Oberlander says, trans folks are more valid than the Confederacy. I don't know if anybody's bothered by that, though. Are you Confederates, you guys?
No.
It's like in the research sense.
I want to
or-
meet a real life Confederate.
Okay, research.
I'm curious on that brand of human.
Next up, thanks. Let's see, we got that one. Mothra J Disco, thanks for your statement saying, CJ, stop debating. You keep getting owned.
I mean, that's fine that you think that. I mean, that's all I got to say about that, really.
Thanks for
No,
being
I'm good too.
thanks for being a good sport with all these these like malicious super chats toward you. I just
Right
love
at his neck.
internet like owned, destroyed, and Phil KO.
blood.
Thanks for
Do
your
people still say pwned? Is that a thing people still say?
No, I think
Yeah,
people stopped saying that a few
BTFO'd.
years ago.
Am I really old? Okay.
I thought it was still cool.
We got BTFO'd.
By the way, speaking of old school internet, Jenna Marbles, you probably saw on Twitter. Am I the only person that saw Jenna Marbles taking some time away from Twitter? Did you guys not see that?
She quit YouTube.
Why is
Oh,
that
no, that's
news?
right. YouTube, sorry. I have a story about,
Oh,
no joke.
quit
You-
all of YouTube?
Well, at least for a while. She's walking away. Now, you guys won't even believe this. Nobody believes it when I tell my first YouTube channel, which is just when I was in college, dinking around, like making like silly videos. Jenna Marbles would subscribe to. I'm serious. I think it was that she used to, like, back then, this is like 2006, everybody would just go sub to like every account you could find. And
Yeah, like because there were like 12, right? There were 12 in total.
yes,
2006.
so it was probably that I just happened to be one of those like thousands that she subbed to, but later she unsubbed. Very discouraging. Next, so thanks for your super chat, Phil Ko. Oh, jeez. Okay, CJ, I'm sorry I have to read this. I mean, they're paying money here. Said CJ again, showing himself to be a garbage human. I'm sorry, CJ.
Hey, it's perfectly fine. I did maybe say like the primary portion of our side of the debate, which is a pretty hated side of the debate, so should be expected.
I appreciate you being a good sport about all these insults. And next up, Ariel Fernandez. Thanks for your question. Said, CJ Cox, do you believe in flat Earth? Trans rights.
No.
Next,
No, the Earth is not flat.
all these little. Okay, next up, the Minor Prophet. Thanks for your question. Said, yes, mouthy words don't come from the sky, but if your definition of man and woman is entirely dependent on what the person identifies as, then it's just a useless concept.
How do I know I'm? Hold on. How do I
Yeah.
know I'm gay? Let's go with that definition. How do I know? I mean,
Wait, hang on.
is there a genetic
Questions
test you can do on
outside.
me? Is there like a blood test you can determine whether or not I'm gay? Is there something you can look at? Do I have like there like that finger length thing? And if one finger is longer than the other, I'm gay. Or
Yes.
do you trust my self-identification because my what's it called? Let's see. My first person authority over my own mental state, it takes precedence. Like I get to decide what I am and how I feel.
Well, can I just chime in real quick though, because that is fundamentally different. Well, how you feel about somebody else, in a sexual situation or a romantic situation, is not the same thing as something that actually has like physical.
But they're both identities. That's the relevant
Both identities,
part.
yeah.
Yeah.
I gotta give Mouthy the last word on this just because the super chat was targeted at him. Emma Ross, thanks for your question, said, Richard and CJ, have either of you actually met and listened to a trans person's perspective?
Several. I go to one of the most liberal universities in the state.
Which state are you in?
I have Ohio.
Okay, gotcha.
Oh, you're like right above me.
Great.
Yeah.
The greatest state in the union.
I live in Kentucky.
would
I'm not
simply
going to
point out, though,
defend
that I don't
Kentucky.
think that that's necessarily relevant. I mean, it helps, but that the truth would not have changed either way for my side or against it if I had talked to a transgender person. It's kind of a non sequitur.
When you say truth, I'm sorry. Do you want us to get through these?
We let's see, I'm trying to think of we only have like maybe one or two more questions. If you want to do a quick pithy response, we'll give you that, and then
Okay, real quick. Yeah, so when you say like delusions and truth and all that stuff, like trans people by and large do not say that they have things that they don't have. They're interpreting their feelings. They're interpreting like how and there's genetic links. There are genetic markers for gender identity. This is not something that you just like, it's fully socially constructed. There is a genetic component. And what they're doing is while their genes interact with while their genes interact with an environment in a way that makes them feel more comfortable and more self-actualized by identifying with a certain gender or as non-binary. So they're not delusion. They're not saying things that aren't true. They're telling you a true version of how they feel and how they want to identify in our current culture.
I give you the last word for our friends who lean right, or for Americans politically right. If you want to respond, you can, and then we'll go to the next one.
I wagged out, so I didn't hear the question, but if you want, CJ.
Yeah, I would just say that they might accurately describe how they feel. That's perfectly fine. But I would again go back to the phrases man and woman are meant to portray biological concepts, right? That's what the definitions that we use, as we have actually agreed upon now in modern society, and of course in the past as well, is that those are referring to the biologically masculine and biologically feminine sides. In fact, the language is so loaded that you can't even describe the two sides without calling one feminine and the other masculine. You know
Are
what I
genes
mean? I mean,
biological?
Got to keep moving.
Okay.
Let's see. 123 Berserk. Thanks for your question. Said Mouthy, how are you defining a man? I am a cis man. If I wanted to identify as a woman, you basically can't tell me I'm wrong according to your argument.
Yeah, not really. I mean, for me, a man is someone whose gender is a man, and gender is sort of an amalgamation of gender identity and gender expression. And because words are defined by how people use them in society, and 99% of the time in society, when someone is using the word man, they're referring to someone who identifies and expresses themselves as a man. That is the definition of a man,
so
and
that-
trans men fall into the definition of men.
Yeah, people
So by
confuse
that
identifying
definition,
and
he-
saying. Hold on, people confuse identifying and saying all the
Right.
time. If this person truly identified as a woman, they'd be a woman. But they're not being genuine with that question. They're saying like, if I said I was a woman, would that make me a woman? Like, no, it is a self-actualization of your intrinsic identity. It's not just.
Yeah, but
saying
isn't it
something.
just how the third party perceives it?
There's a certain truth to that, like how you're perceived by other people has a lot to do with like.
Well,
your
isn't that the
identity.
crux? Isn't that the crux of Mouthy's argument?
The crux of my argument is that when we use the word man, in almost every case, we're referring to someone who identifies and expresses themselves as a man. What
Okay, so
determines
by
how
that definition, he
Right.
could just theoretically say that he is a woman.
he
Yes.
could,
No,
if he's
saying
no,
versus- It's a
saying
simple-
is an
it's a si-
no, saying and
I know.
identifying.
I
aren't
know
the same.
you're. I
There's-
know you want to
Well,
get.
no, it's
nitty.
not like it's not a nitpick. It's a really important distinction to make. Like identifying is a really like complex psychological like phenomenon. Like one's identity has roots in like genes, and it's a really complex thing. Yeah.
I feel
Gotcha.
like
Hold on one
you're
second. I
attributing-
hate to do this, but just because we've got limited time and the super chat was directed at Mouthy, I want to give him the last word. So Brutus Lugo, thanks for your question. Said, "What is a woman and what is a man? How do you distinguish between the two?" I think maybe this is for all parties. I'm not sure.
That's got to be Mouthy, right?
I mean, I would say that it's kind of everybody. I mean, not everybody. Sorry, I was responding to both the things you said, the who's it to, and then, anyways, I would say that there's numerous ways you can kind of tell the difference. There's a lot of superficial differences, by which I mean things that you can just see with the eye. For example, men on average are 30% bigger than females are. We tend to be taller. We tend to have more muscle mass. There's obviously, you can do studies to look at the testosterone levels, and men will on average have higher testosterone levels, and so on and so forth. There's numerous differences that you could look at that would indicate differences between the genders. But just the pure definition, I mean, man is defined as an adult human male, and male is defined as a male person, plant, or animal.
Yeah,
Right,
you're saying that it's the definition because it's the definition. It's a circular argument.
It's a tautology. Yeah, it's a tautology.
The only way that I. Okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead. We'll let everybody answer, and then.
Yeah.
I just think I don't think it's as simple as just being like, hey, it's XX or XY, like whatever that your sex chromosome set is. But I think it also incorporates whatever your sexual, what your role in the sexual relationship is between the two parties. And I just don't think that having the ability to to physically change your body makes you biologically different.
So something I really want to hammer home here is that identity doesn't come from like things below the neck. Like it doesn't come from your genitalia. It doesn't come from your arms or your legs or your knees.
We have
identity,
to separate those two.
Yeah, identity is rooted in your brain. And so when you were saying earlier, like it's biological, well, genes are biological, genetics are biological. And according to a paper published in Behavior Genetics titled The Biological Contributions to Gender Identity and Gender Diversity, bringing data to the table, they conclude that gender identity is a multifactorial complex trait with heritable polygenetic components. Basically, your gender identity is rooted in your genetics. So when you're saying I am a man, that is partly rooted in your genetics, whether you're cis, whether you're a cis man or a trans man, that statement is rooted in your genetics and how your self-actualization is influenced by and interpreted in your culture.
Give Mouthy a chance to answer, and then we'll go to the next one.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, I know I sound like a broken record, but the idea that, like, the definition of a man is going to be determined by, like, your biology, when that's clearly not how we use the word in any cases, that just doesn't seem like that's a good definition.
Next up, thanks for your question, Ariel Fernandez, who says, which is the flag of the free? O Washington's flag with the stripes and the stars, will you give such name to the thing with the bars? Appreciate that. You can tell we'll read anything here. Okay, next up, Achilles, thanks for your question, said, language is a human construct. The definitions of words change constantly. To hold to one definition is futile. If a definition isn't good, it won't catch on.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, what do you mean? What do you mean?
Making.
What's the definition exactly? Because apparently, I've just decided all of a sudden that the definition of the word definition doesn't actually mean.
Well, no, you can't as a person, but like broadly, society defines words.
Okay, well,
like,
society
words.
defines man and woman to mean.
Wait, okay, no, but they don't though, because
They don't.
when
Literally
you
do. I
in
just read it
any
from-
no
from
in
the
any
dictionary.
social no in any the dictionary tries to track how society uses words. It doesn't dictate how society ought to use words. Dictionary
hold up,
definition.
you're changing
Wait,
said
hold on.
how-
No, hold on. Dictionary definitions can be wrong because the definition of a word is defined by how people use it, because words are just things we use to communicate certain concepts to each other.
Yeah,
So
and
the
when we
definition
use the
of a
words
word is
man
determined
and-
by how
man and
people
women,
use
you're
it.
talking about
So
males and
if the dictionary says that a word means one thing and that's not how people use it, the dictionary definition can be wrong.
Let me give the last word to CJ, and we got to move to the next one.
Like that absolutely is the way that people use it. And in fact, you even just said yourself in what you were just saying there in your answer, you said yourself that what the dictionary is trying to do is show how people commonly use that word. Well, if people commonly use the word man to refer to the biological male,
They don't.
then they literally do. I have never heard anybody.
Can you
except
see
for
my
a transgender
chromosomes?
Must
activist
move to
my
the next one
chromosomes.
very quickly.
Okay, sorry.
Ariel, well, we got that one. We got General Ballsack. Thanks for your comment, who said, great debate all around. So glad you enjoyed it. I enjoyed it as well. It's been very fun. Taliesin Overlander, thanks for your question, who said, what is a man? A miserable pile of secrets. I don't know what that's from at all.
It's Castlevania Symphony of the Night, right?
Life.
And life, obviously.
Is it a movie?
No, it's a PS1 game, I think.
Oh.
I think, right? Am I getting that right, Chad?
I can't remember.
Next,
It was one of those older systems.
thank you for your question, or let's see, insult Naladower for CJ, who says the pure quote unquote definition. CJ sounds like a cultist. I'm like, CJ, sorry, buddy, you've been accused of everything tonight. Now a cultist. Are you a cultist, CJ?
A cultist.
Well, to be fair, if you want to get technical with the definition of the word cultist, I am a Christian, and any religion could be defined as a cult. So yeah, but no.
Let's
the
talk
colloquial
definitions.
definition, yeah.
Let's
not-
talk definitions.
Thank you. And Brutus Logo, thanks for your question, said, Mouthy and Jangle, how do you distinguish between man and woman, and how do you define the two?
I distinguish between men and women based on my cultural understanding of what men and women means in my culture. That's all. When in doubt, I go by self-identification. So if I see someone who I can't really tell, I'll either try to, guess by the way they interact with me, or I might even just straight up ask. My definition of, I'm sorry.
But does it doesn't, you know what, go ahead. It's going to take too long. We're going to take
Yeah,
too long, and I don't want to go down that
I
rabbit
don't
hole.
know. If you'd like to hear my definition of woman or man or non-binary person, a woman, man, or non-binary person is one whose first-person authority over their own mental attitudes most closely aligns with their respective interpretations of gender categorizations in their culture. I know that's really wordy
I
and not
second
very
that,
pithy,
yeah.
and is not the pithy 30-word definition, but it's one
No
that I think
problem.
is more representative.
Yeah,
Appreciate
What
I'll
about the
second that.
consistencies, though? Just out of curiosity, are we just supposed to overlook the things that not every man, but every man that has X or XY?
This would
And
this would fully encapsulate them as well. Like I said, everybody has a gender identity, and the cis men who identify as men, like myself, we would fit this definition pretty well.
Next, want to say thanks so much, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. Also want to say thanks so much to the mods. Always, it's just you guys help make it possible, keeping order, and I appreciate those high standards that we ask of you, mods, in terms of, I know that sometimes people make fun of you, that whatever it is, not as bad as CJ, but I mean, and you have stuck to your values of we only have one rule, which is that we only ban with no warning hate speech. Obviously, that's gone. And then if somebody's harassing somebody like CJ, we will usually give them a warning. Tonight we just let them run amok. But thank you for everybody just hanging out with us. We usually do ask you to not harass people, though, and we'll at least give you a warning for that. But want to say, all of the speakers, if you've enjoyed this, folks, as much as I have, all of their links are waiting down in the description so you can hear plenty more where that came from. And so, last of all, sorry about that, tapping the old mic. Want to say thanks so much to our speakers. This channel, the reason that it's fun is because of the speakers, and so we want to say thanks so much, Mouthy, Jangles, CJ, and Richard. Really appreciate you guys coming on tonight. It's been a true pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for having us. I had a lot of fun. I hope everyone else did too.
That's my
Likewise.
That's talking about.
Absolutely. And then we just had Ariel Fernandez fire in a last-minute super chat saying, I'm going to play the song Libre when Biden wins. I don't understand. Is that a new song? Dang it! You guys always take advantage of the fact that what is it called? I'm a boomer! Okay, next up, Moyet Morgan, thanks for your question. Last question came in, said, CJ, how can a, quote, spirit or, quote, God identify as a man?
I mean, not really relevant to what we're talking about, but it's an interesting question, I'll be honest with you. I would affirm to you that the God of the Bible is absolutely masculine because he has revealed himself as so, and what that means, I have literally not the slightest clue. So do with that information what you will.
Gotcha. And then, thanks so much, everybody. I want to just be sure, in case there were any last-minute super chats, I don't want to just kind of ignore you. Okay, got everything. So thanks so much, folks. Hope you have a great rest of your night. We'll see you tomorrow as Dr. Richard Carrier and Jonathan Sheffield cross swords on whether or not the resurrection occurred. So thanks so much, and have a great rest of your Thursday or Friday.